The soup stayed untouched, because someone never lived to taste it. Welcome to Marple Mysteries. I am your host, Harrington. Let's grow this community. Share where you're listening from. Your comments make this journey richer. Here's what happened. If I had a nickel for every time a gourmet dish sparked something that wasn't hunger in Nero Wolfe, I could buy the orchid house a new roof. But that Wednesday afternoon in March, when the sun was acting shy and Fritz was wrestling a stack of onions in the kitchen, I got a taste of what happens when food isn't served, and it stirred more than Wolfe's appetite. The phone rang at 2:11 p.m., which is practically the witching hour in the brownstone. Wolfe was upstairs tending to me, orchids. I was at my desk, sipping coffee and reading the latest bulletin from Inspector Kramer's very public war against gambling dens. So when the bell chirped, I let it ring twice before picking up. The voice that greeted me wasn't a stranger's, but it had the energy of a man with a problem marinated in nerves and confusion. "Is this Mr. Goodwin?" It was a man's voice, clipped, nasal, with that edge that comes from either a private school education or a mother who corrected your diction with a ruler. "You got him," I said. "This is Archie Goodwin. Who wants to know? My name is Ellis Vanderlane. I need to speak to Mr. Wolfe immediately." "Congratulations," I said. "So do a lot of people. Some want his help, some want his opinion, some want to know how he keeps his weight so consistent. The answer to all three is the same. He doesn't get on the phone." There was a pause. I could hear him breathing. "This is a matter of significance. It concerns a luncheon that was to take place today, and a dish that wasn't served." "Try Yelp," I said. "We're not a food complaint hotline." The breath came in harder now. "No, Mr. Goodwin, you misunderstand. The meal wasn't forgotten. It was avoided. There was a guest expected. He never arrived. And now I'm not sure he ever intended to." That earned him a raised eyebrow from me. Not that he could see it. "You threw a luncheon, the guest bailed, the soup stayed cold." Tragedy, but not exactly our usual beat. "It was Borscht," he said, low and urgent. "And the man who didn't arrive is Hugo de Mary, my uncle, a man who has never missed a meal in his life, especially not when pickled beets and cream are involved." I leaned back in the chair and swiveled it slightly toward the ceiling. "And you think he's what? Missing? Dead? Kidnapped?" "By cabbage syndicates, I think," he said. "He was never planning to come at all. I think the invitation was a ruse. But I can't explain it, not yet. I need Mr. Wolfe to hear the situation." That's when the voice behind me said, "Archie, send him in." I turned. Wolfe was standing at the foot of the stairs, hands clasped, behind his back like a bishop guarding the altar. That was fast, even for him. Either he'd been hovering or the orchids had mutinied and driven him out. I cupped the receiver. "You want this guy in the office?" "I do," he said, "and have Fritz prepare a pot of Russian caravan with lemon." "Fine," I told. The phone. "Come to the brownstone, 3535 West 35th. Bring your appetite." And a reason. Ellis Vanderlane arrived 40 minutes later, dressed like a man who inherited money and never quite figured out whether to be embarrassed about it. He was mid-30s, sandy-haired with a part so straight it could have been surveyed, and he wore a camel-hair coat that had seen better winters. He declined Fritz's tea and settled into the red chair across from Wolfe with a sigh like it owed him rent. Wolfe studied him. "I don't mean he looked at him. I mean he studied him the way some people peer into microscopes or suspicious soufflés." "I am not the police, Mr. Vanderlane," Wolfe said without preamble. "You must be precise." Vanderlane nodded. "I had scheduled a luncheon for today, 1 o'clock at the Knickerbocker Club, private room. The guest of honor was to be my uncle, Hugo de Mary. He accepted the invitation last week, confirmed it yesterday. And then, nothing, no call, no arrival, and no response since. "Have you contacted his residence?" I asked. "Yes," no answer. "The man's grown," I said. "Maybe he forgot. Maybe he had a better offer." "No," Vanderlane said. "Not?" Uncle Hugo, he's many things. Difficult, paranoid, obsessive, but never careless. Especially not when food is involved. He's a creature of pattern. Wolfe's eyes hadn't moved. And the soup. The borscht was chosen by him. It's his ritual. When he accepts a meeting, he selects the menu, always a Slavic dish. Always symbolic. Symbolic? I echoed. Hugo believes food contains intent, energy. He's written on the subject. In fact, he's preparing a book. Wolfe grunted. It could have been interest or indigestion. Vanderlane leaned forward. This isn't about lunch. It's about why he never planned to attend it. I think he was sending a message. Or protecting. Himself. Or testing me. I can't explain it. But if you met him, you'd understand. I glanced at Wolfe. His expression hadn't changed, but I knew that little twitch at the corner of his lip. It meant something had stirred beneath the layers of disdain and inertia. I'm not sure what service you're requesting, Mr. Vanderlane, Wolfe said. I want you to find out why he disappeared, what the missed meal meant, and what game he's playing, if any. You believe it is a game. I'm not sure, but if it is, I think someone else is playing it with him. Or against him. That got Wolfe's attention. Games within games. A disappearing eccentric. A ritualized. Dish gone untouched. And a reason known only to him that made Wolfe glance my way and murmur, "Very well." I scribbled a note in my pad and stood. Guess I'm skipping dessert. Wolfe shut his eyes. Find the man. Start with his last known location. Ask Fritz for the tea. And Archie. Exercise discretion. That's always my first choice, I said, right after sarcasm. And with that, the case of the unslurpable borscht had begun. By the time I got to Hugo Domery's Upper East Side co-op, the wind had turned mean, and my hat was regretting its partnership with my head. The building was one of those trimmed limestone palaces, with a doorman whose job was mostly to sneer at people who didn't have the right kind of scuff on their shoes. I gave him my name, got a once-over that could have peeled paint, and was told Mr. Domery hadn't been seen that day. Not like him, the man admitted, eyes narrowed. He usually takes his constitutional around 11, makes a lap of the block. Same trench coat, same cane, same cigar that smells like despair. That earned a note in my pocketbook and a crack about the strength of his observational skills that I decided to keep to myself. The man wasn't hostile, just seasoned, like a steak you could pound nails with. The elevator was staffed, gold-trimmed and silent all the way up to the 9th floor. Domery's door, 9C, was shut, locked, and when I knocked, impressively indifferent. I tried the bell, no answer. I stood there a minute, listening for anything. Footsteps, the creak of floorboards, a paranoid loner fumbling for a revolver, but the only sound was the low drone of some distant vacuum cleaner and my own suspicion clicking into place. A neighbor 2 doors down came out in a robe and a look of gentle nosiness. Elderly, coiffed and made entirely of lavender perfume and fur slippers. "You looking for Hugo?" she asked. "That's the plan." "You're not the police, are you?" I showed her my license. "No, ma'am. Just another flavor of pest." "You see Mr. Domery today?" "Not since yesterday morning. He came home with a briefcase and a bag of groceries." I waved. He grunted. "That's Hugo. If he didn't grunt, I'd call the paramedics." "Anything unusual?" She gave it a thought. "Only that he didn't bring up his paper this morning. He always does. 7 sharp. Stands there in his robe and scowls at the headlines like they owe him money." I thanked her and tried the buzzer again. Nothing. Back at street level, I called the office. Fritz answered. "Wolfe," I said, "needs to know this. Hugo's a no-show at home. Neighbors haven't seen him. Paper untouched. Mailbox full. Could try charming the super for a key, or we can try a different tack." There was a pause. Then Fritz, prim and faintly conspiratorial, said, "Mr. Wolfe says to return. He's had a visitor." I didn't argue. If Wolfe was opening the gates of the brownstone mid-afternoon for an uninvited guest, then something was squirming under his skin. and that meant the plot was warming up like one of Fritz's slow-cooked sauces. When I got back to 35th Street, the door was open, the air smelled faintly of oregano and cigar ash, and I found Wolfe exactly where God and gravity intended, planted in the office chair behind his desk, arms folded, eyes half-lidded like he was meditating on the theory of everything. In the yellow chair sat a woman. Now, I don't often pause for the scenery, but this one could pause traffic. Not in the glamorous lipstick on a magazine cover sense, though she could have passed muster there too, but in the I have secrets and know how to use them way. Early 40s maybe. Jet hair in a neat coil, hands like she'd been taught to pour tea at finishing school, and cheekbones that probably had their own passport stamps. Wolfe didn't bother introducing her, which meant either she hadn't given her name or he didn't care to repeat it. She looked at me, studied me, then said, "You're Mr. Goodwin." Only on days that end in Y, she didn't smile. "You were looking for Mr. Domerry?" "Still am," I said, hanging up my coat. "Have you got a better idea where to find him?" "I might, depending on what? On whether Mr. Wolfe intends to take the case seriously, or if this is all some kind of expensive hobby." That earned her the first real reaction from Wolfe, a slight lift of the brow, the kind of movement that, in his language, meant he was either insulted or intrigued. "Maybe both. I do not suffer distractions lightly," Wolfe said. "Mr. Vanderlyn brought us a curiosity. I permitted it to develop. Now it appears to have companions." "I'm not a companion," she said smoothly. "I'm a warning. I stayed standing, letting my eyes wander back and forth between the two of them, like a referee waiting for the first swing. "Explain," Wolfe said. "My name is Celia Domerry. I'm Hugo's niece by marriage. Or was. My late husband, Charles, died last year. Hugo never liked me, thought I was beneath the Domerry line. I make no judgments on lineage," Wolfe said, "only on reason. Why are you here?" "Because I saw Ellis Vanderlyn this morning, and I know him. If he's come here, then he thinks this is more than a no-show luncheon. Which means Hugo has made another one of his moves." "Moves?" I asked. She flicked a glance at me. "You're not unfamiliar with people who manipulate from the shadows, Mr. Goodwin. Hugo collects power plays the way children collect stamps. Each relationship is a test, a trap, a study in leverage." Sounds charming, she ignored that. "Ellis is fragile. He thinks Hugo was setting up some kind of meeting, when the truth is, if I'm right, he was already planning to disappear. Not because he's in danger, but because he wanted someone else to think he was. For what purpose? To expose someone, maybe Ellis, maybe me. Hugo believes the world's a board and we're all pawns in his little chess match. The only difference is, he refuses to declare checkmate until everyone's bruised." I crossed my arms. "Why tell us this?" "Because I think he's gone too far. And if you're going to help Ellis, then you need to understand something now. Hugo Domerry doesn't vanish unless he's pulling a string, and the string is probably wrapped around somebody's neck." She stood then. Wolfe didn't object. "If he contacts you," she added, "don't trust what he says and don't think you're the only one watching." Then she left, the scent of her perfume trailing behind like an unfinished thought. I turned to Wolfe. "We've got a vanishing uncle, a manipulative streak a mile wide, and a niece who talks like she just left a Cold War summit. Thoughts?" Wolfe reached for a fresh bottle of beer. "None I care to voice, not yet. But you believe she knows something?" He took a sip. "I believe Hugo Domerry invited scrutiny. The question is, of what?" I nodded slowly. "Guess I'd better find out what exactly Mr. Domerry was working on before he became Houdini." Wolfe closed his eyes. "See if Mr. Panzer is available tomorrow. And Archie, be wary of motives dressed in civility. They often conceal sharper instruments." "Nice," I said. "I'll make sure to bring gloves." And just like that, the brownstone had been disturbed, and Wolfe was beginning to listen, Celia Domery's perfume had barely faded from the upholstery when Wolfe sent me to find out what Hugo had been working on before he ghosted the Knickerbocker, and left a pot of borscht wondering what it had done wrong. And if there was one place more likely than a psychiatrist's couch to reveal a man's inner madness, it was his publisher's office. Ellis had mentioned Hugo was working on a manuscript, something dense and philosophical, probably involving the metaphysical importance of consommé. I dug around and found out the publisher was a boutique operation called Ink and Form, nestled in a third-floor walk-up on East 20th. The kind of place with unwashed windows, literary posters curling off the walls, and a receptionist who looked like she edited poetry for revenge. She told me Hugo's editor was named Keith Rayner, and if I didn't have an appointment, I'd need divine intervention or lunch bribes to get past the front desk. Luckily, I've got charm. Or at least persistence. Rayner was a 30-something academic with corduroy pants, hair like a scarecrow with tenure, and a voice that made every sentence sound like a footnote. He had a permanent squint and enough coffee mugs on his desk to stock a thrift store, Domery, he said once I'd introduced myself and dropped Wolfe's name like a safe. Yes, I know Hugo. Sort of. You never really know Hugo. You just try not to misquote him. I leaned on the edge of his desk. He was working on something before he vanished. Rayner nodded and pushed aside a manuscript the size of a Manhattan phone book. A book, half memoir, half screed. He called it Sacred Meals and the Lies We Swallow. Dramatic, but that was Hugo. What's it about? The psychology of food, mostly. Symbolism, ritual, control. He argued that the way we serve and withhold meals is a map to human manipulation. He believed that refusing a meal, or not showing up for one, was more powerful than any insult. That explained the whole Borscht affair. Did he mention anyone he was writing about? Or feuding with? Rayner scratched his chin. He hinted, at including stories from his family. Said the Domery name was riddled with emotional entanglements and performative civility. Whatever that means. It means he enjoyed stirring the pot before throwing it at someone. I pressed him for more. Had Hugo said anything about being threatened, watched, or blackmailed? Had anyone come by the office asking questions? Only one person had, Rayner said. A woman. Dark hair, well-dressed, intense. Didn't give her name but asked about the manuscript. Wanted to know how far along it was, claimed to be related. Celia, I asked. Could have been, Rayner said. She didn't introduce herself, and I didn't press. She had that energy that makes you feel like you owe her something. I thanked him and asked for a copy of whatever Hugo had submitted so far. Rayner hesitated, said he needed Hugo's consent, which was currently unavailable in both the legal and metaphysical sense, but eventually agreed to give me the table of contents and an excerpt. Back in the cab, I read the sample. Chapter 4. The empty plate as indictment. Hugo's prose was what you'd expect from a man who'd once tried to have a caterer arrested for moral fraud, dense, erudite, and humming with veiled accusations. One passage stuck with me. The meal refused is the weapon unsheathed. It says, I see you, I condemn you, I do not break bread with enemies. That wasn't philosophy. That was personal. When I returned to the brownstone, Wolfe was mid-session, with the orchids, and Fritz was plating something that smelled like veal and diplomacy. I gave Wolfe the summary, the sample, and the identity of our mystery visitor to the publisher's office. He read in silence. When he finished, he closed his eyes and said, The niece knew more than she admitted. She usually did. I said, Want me to lean on her? No, not yet. He opened his eyes. We must understand the pattern first. This Domery did not vanish. He choreographed an absence, like a magician, like a tactician, Wolfe corrected. He has launched a campaign. The luncheon was the first volley. And what's the battlefield? Wolfe tapped the manuscript page with one thick finger. The book, the Borscht, and the people named between the lines. I knew that tone. We were off the trail and into the thickets now. Later that evening, as I was halfway through a Scotch and the crossword, Fritz announced we had another visitor. This one hadn't called first. It was a man, tall, lean, eyes like steel bolts. He introduced himself as Peyton Thorne, Hugo Domery's former assistant. I heard from Ellis that you were looking into Hugo's disappearance, he said. I thought you should know. He left something behind for me. A letter, that was good. Letters mean intent, letters mean planning. Where is it? Wolfe asked. Thorne reached into his coat and handed it over. Wolfe unfolded it slowly. I leaned over his shoulder, reading aloud. Peyton, if I do not return by the evening of the 25th, assume the manuscript is no longer safe. Someone is trying to silence me. Trust no one who asks for pages, especially those who shared my table HD. The letter was dated 2 days ago. Wolfe stared at it, unmoving, then said, Bring the manuscript here, all of it, tomorrow. Thorne hesitated. You think it's necessary? I think, Wolfe said. Mr. Domery intended to be found, but only by someone who understood his language. You are not that person, I am. Thorne left without further questions. I turned to Wolfe. Someone who shared his table? Wolfe's mouth thinned. We must determine which meal he means, and whom. He meant not to serve. And with that, the circle of suspects began to form, and the menu of motives was getting clearer by the course. The next morning arrived on the heels of a grey drizzle that made the windows sweat and the sidewalks slick. Fritz served eggs Florentine and a righteous pot of Kona coffee, which Wolfe praised with a grunt, high praise by his standards. Peyton Thorne was due by 10, manuscript in hand, and Wolfe had cancelled his morning orchid session to prepare for what he expected would be, as he put it, an encounter with the deranged genius of a man discontent with mere provocation. By 10:15, Thorne still hadn't shown. By 10:30, Wolfe was eyeing the door like it had insulted his ancestry. At 10:42, the bell rang. I opened the door to find not Peyton Thorne, but a delivery man holding a plain cardboard box and a clipboard, with my name spelled right. I signed, tipped, and carried it to the office. Wolfe watched from his desk, arms crossed like a pharaoh evaluating tribute. The box was heavier than it looked, about the size of a large loaf pan, sealed with brown tape and no return label. Inside were 4 thick notebooks, handwritten. No note. No instructions. Wolfe didn't touch them. He nodded at me. Catalogue. I spent the next 90 minutes going through what turned out to be Domery's manuscript drafts. The pages were numbered, and while the handwriting sloped like a mountain road in places, it was legible. I skimmed while I logged, Wolfe listening silently. The chapters ran in order, 12 in total. Some were theoretical, some read like memoir, and others were thinly veiled profiles of people Hugo had clearly known and, from the tone, barely tolerated. Chapter 5 was titled, Guests Who Devour Without Gratitude. That one read like a vendetta wrapped in literary lace. It described a dinner party with a woman who, according to Hugo, took second helpings of my bread pudding while delivering barbs designed to emasculate my intellect. The woman was unnamed, but the description sounded suspiciously like someone who'd taught finishing school and considered honesty a blunt weapon, someone not unlike Celia Domery. Chapter 7. The Mouths That Lie described a guest who praised a ragout, only to be caught telling another guest it tasted like warmed-over regret. The phrase was so specific, I felt it had to be a quote. Hugo had annotated the margin with a single word. Peyton. Lovely company, I said, flipping through more pages. He makes the average Thanksgiving dinner sound like a power struggle at the Kremlin. Wolfe grunted. What made the manuscript more interesting, though, were the gaps. Chapter 9 was entirely missing. The index mentioned it. Inheritance by ingestion, the Last Supper principle. But the pages jumped from chapter 8 to chapter 10. I pointed it out to Wolfe. Deliberate omission, or a theft. That word landed like a dropped knife. You think someone removed it from the drafts? If Domerry trusted Peyton Thorne, and if Peyton received this manuscript in full before its delivery, then its current state suggests interference, which means someone else got to it first. I flipped back to the front page, looking for any marks. There was one, top right corner, a faint smudge, possibly ash or ink. Wolfe noticed too, cigar, he said. That matched what the doorman had said. Hugo smoked pungent cigars, but why would a page be removed? What was in that chapter? Wolfe rang for Fritz and asked him to summon Saul Panzer. Fritz, efficient as, always nodded and left without a question. We weren't calling the cavalry yet, just a scout. If anyone could find a vanishing assistant or a missing page in a city the size of a small universe, it was Saul. While we waited, Wolfe gave the manuscript a second, deeper skim. He didn't like handling loose paper, but necessity overrode fastidiousness. His eyes moved faster than you'd think for a man who hated haste. I watched as he stopped occasionally, reread lines, and hummed quietly, a tone I'd come to recognize as his version of intellectual digestion. Then Wolfe looked up and said, "The missing chapter is the fulcrum. Everything pivots on it. What makes you sure?" Because Domerry described the preceding chapters as stage setting, and chapter 10 refers to the chapter prior as the turning of the blade. That chapter was not lost by accident. It was removed because it contained something intolerable. To someone still at large. We sat with that a moment. Then Fritz reappeared with Saul in tow. Panzer looked like a banker, moved like a cat, and had the professional discretion of a well-paid ghost. He greeted Wolfe with a nod, and me with a flicker of a smile. No pleasantries, just business. Wolfe gave him a precise summary of events, ending with, "Find Peyton Thorne. If he is unharmed, secure him. If he is evasive, watch him. If he is missing, report immediately, and Archie will assist." I stood, grabbing my coat. "You think Thorne had the chapter and someone made him disappear?" "I think," Wolfe said, "we are dancing around a sabotage masquerading as literature, and our next move is overdue." Panzer and I headed out. His plan was to check Thorne's apartment first, a third-floor walk-up on West End Avenue. I let him take lead. The door was locked, no answer. But the neighbor, a shaggy-haired actor type in pajamas, volunteered that Thorne hadn't been home since the afternoon before. Said he had something urgent to deliver, looked rattled. That lined up with the delivery time of the manuscript. "Did he say where he was going?" Saul asked. "Nope. But he dropped his keys in the hallway. I left them on the sill. Thought he'd come back. He hadn't. Inside the apartment, everything was in place except the desk drawer. It had been forced, not clumsily, but fast and dirty. The wood was splintered. A space inside was bare, rectangle-shaped, about the size of a file folder. I looked at Saul. "Think that was where the missing chapter lived?" He nodded. "Or whatever was so sensitive, he didn't want to mail it. We took photos, logged details, and locked the door behind us." Saul said he'd run down Thorne's last phone calls. I headed back to the brownstone with the update. Wolfe listened, unmoving, as I relayed it all. When I finished, he said only, "We must invite Miss Celia Domerry to tea." That meant one thing. Suspicion had shifted, and the circle of suspects was no longer abstract. It had its first name. Celia Domerry arrived at the brownstone that evening dressed for deflection. Navy sheath dress, ivory shawl, and a brooch shaped like a bird in flight. She brought the same air of calculated poise with her, but this time it came with a hint of curiosity, curled at the corners of her mouth. If I'd had to bet, I'd say she'd expected the summons, maybe even welcomed it. Some people like the stage. Even when it's a trapdoor in disguise, Fritz showed her in promptly at 6. Wolfe had insisted on the hour. He claimed his digestion was optimal then for passing nonsense from nuance. I had the feeling he also wanted to see how she'd react to tea served without borscht. She didn't flinch. "Miss Domery," Wolfe said, without standing. "Please be seated. Mr. Goodwin will serve tea." I did, with the grace of a butler and the mood of a man who'd been tailing ghosts all day. She accepted the cup, looked at it, then raised an eyebrow. "No sugar. You." "I'm not here for indulgence," Wolfe said. "You are here for clarity." She met his gaze evenly. "You believe I'm withholding something." "I know you are," he said. "The question is why." That for once seemed to knock her off balance, but only for a second. "You think I know where Hugo is?" "No. I think you knew what he was planning, and you hoped it would unfold on your terms." She took a careful sip of tea. "I know Hugo's games, Mr. Wolfe. I've lived through enough of them. But this one is different. He's never gone this far before." Wolfe adjusted in his chair, the leather giving a low sigh. "You visited his publisher." Her grip on the teacup tightened by a fraction. "Not enough for a jury, but more than enough for Wolfe. I asked about his manuscript, yes. That's not a crime." "Depending on your purpose," Wolfe said. "You knew he was writing about the family, about his meals, his grudges, his indictments." She didn't answer immediately. That was answer enough. I sat forward. "He used food like other people use threats. You know that. So when he set that lunch with Ellis and didn't show, that was the opening move." "I told you that much already." "You told us it was a game," I said. "You didn't tell us he might have been baiting a trap for someone in his circle, or that he feared retaliation." Wolfe said, "We've read the manuscript, what survived of it. One chapter is missing, chapter 9, that got her attention." A full heartbeat passed before she spoke. "He didn't mention that chapter to me," she said slowly. "But I know he was writing something more pointed. He told me it was about inheritance by appetite." "Meaning what?" I asked. She looked at me. "He believed the dinner table was a battlefield, that every meal shared by family was a negotiation, that people give themselves away with how they eat. What they demand, what they refuse." I gave a low whistle. "Sounds like Thanksgiving at your place was a hoot." "Hugo saw people as predators," she said, voice clipped. "And if he thought you wanted something from him, money, control, affection, he would test you." "Was anyone failing those tests recently?" Wolfe asked. She hesitated, then nodded. "Ellis and Peyton." Wolfe's brow lowered. "Explain." Ellis was pressing Hugo to name him executor of the estate. Hugo loathed paperwork and thought Ellis had the right temperament, but also believed he was weak, too pliable. He'd started to test him, sending contradictory instructions, promising, then revoking responsibilities. And Thorne. Peyton wanted to co-author the manuscript, claimed Hugo's ideas were brilliant but disorganized, and that he could make them coherent. Hugo was furious, accused him of intellectual theft. And yet, Wolfe said dryly, he trusted him to deliver the manuscript. She looked at me. "Did he?" I shrugged. "He was supposed to, but the chapter's gone, and so is Peyton." She blinked. "You think, what? That Peyton stole it?" "We think someone did," Wolfe said, "and that someone had a reason to remove that specific section. Perhaps it exposed them." Celia Domery crossed her legs and leaned back, thoughtful. "You think the missing chapter names a culprit?" "No," Wolfe said. "I think it implicates one, Naming is crude. Hugo preferred the blade beneath the napkin. She gave the smallest smile. Yes, he would. I watched her a moment. So where does that leave us? With two suspects, both possible thieves, and a vanished old man orchestrating the whole thing from somewhere off stage. She didn't reply, which is what made me lean forward and ask, "Tell me something, Miss Domery. Did Hugo ever use food against you?" She met my gaze. Her expression was neutral, too neutral. There was a dinner a year ago after my husband's funeral, just the two of us. He served beef tongue. Wolfe sat upright, his interest visibly piqued. Symbolic of silence, she said. He told me so, said it was a test. That if I ate it, I was accepting the terms of the Domery legacy. And did you? She sipped her tea. I took a bite, then left the rest untouched. I nodded slowly. Which meant what to him? I don't know, she said. But he never invited me back. Wolfe closed his eyes. That is enough. She frowned. Enough for what? For now, he said. You may go. We will contact you if needed. Celia Domery rose, every inch of her posture immaculate. I hope you find him. I expect we will, Wolfe said. The question is, how many secrets will follow him out of hiding? She didn't answer. Just nodded and walked out, shawl trailing behind her like a flag in retreat. When the door clicked shut, I turned to Wolfe. You believe her? No, he said, not at all. I believe she told us one truth, the beef tongue. That's our start. He opened his eyes. Find Ellis Vanderlane. We must determine what Hugo left on his plate. And just like that, the table was set for the next course. Ellis Vanderlane answered the door in a blazer that didn't fit, and a look that said sleep had been optional. His apartment on Park and 79th was tastefully underwhelming. Walnut. Floors modern art. Expensive furniture that suggested a decorator had done the thinking for him. The kind of place where no one cooks, but the fridge is still sub-zero. Mr. Goodwin, he said, stepping aside. Is something wrong? I never visit unless something is, I replied, brushing past him, though I'm happy to fake a social call if you've got something wet and bracing. He didn't. I followed him into the living room where the coffee table held a pile of newspapers, unopened mail and a single crystal tumbler, with what looked like a regrettable scotch. He gestured to a chair. I took it. I've just spoken to Celia, he said, sitting opposite me. She told me Wolfe is focusing on the manuscript. And Peyton. That's right. He rubbed the back of his neck. I didn't know Peyton was missing. Neither did we, but we've got signs, a broken drawer, a vanishing act, and one fewer chapter than expected. Ellis winced. Chapter 9? I froze. You knew it was missing? I suspected. Hugo had referenced it. To me cryptically. Said it was the only chapter he couldn't trust anyone to edit. Did he say why? He stood, began pacing. He said it was his final meal, the last course in the banquet. That once it was served, all illusions would be stripped. That it would reveal what he called the inheritor's appetite. I watched him. And you think you were the inheritor? I hope to be. I mean, he had no children. My father, his brother, died years ago. He always said I was the closest thing he had to continuity. And yet he was testing you, I said. Changing instructions, giving and withdrawing trust. Yes, he said bitterly. And I played along. I thought it was some morbid way of preparing me. But now I think he never intended to give me anything. That he was trying to expose me or drive me out. Did you ask him? Twice. He responded by mailing me a single clove of garlic in a box with a note that said, to keep these vampires out. That sounded like Hugo. I leaned forward. Did you know Celia had visited his publisher? He blinked. No. Why would she? To see how far along the book was, or what it might contain. He dropped into the couch again. "This is madness." "No," I said. "This is Wolfe's territory and Hugo's playground. You're both dancing to music he picked in advance." He rubbed his temples. "What do you want from me? A timeline? The last time you saw Hugo in person. That would have been 5 days ago. I visited his apartment. He made us tea, said he was feeling delicate. We didn't discuss the estate. He wanted to talk about betrayal." My ears perked. "What kind?" "Philosophical," he said. "Betrayal of purpose." I had no idea what he meant. He was in one of his moods. Grand, paranoid, cryptic. Did he mention Peyton? Only to say he didn't know if Peyton was a thief or a mirror. That gave me pause. Meaning? I assumed he meant Peyton was either stealing his ideas or merely reflecting them, echoing Hugo's own thinking back at him. Hugo didn't trust mimicry. "Or assistance," I muttered. Ellis stood again, wandered to a small sideboard, poured himself a splash of brandy. "I don't understand any of this." "Neither do we, not yet." I stood and moved toward the door. "One last thing," I said. "At that luncheon, you expected borscht. Why?" He told me to arrange it. He said it was to be symbolic. That the dish mattered more than the conversation. Did he say how? No, only that the color was important. He said it must be red enough to suggest consequence. "Blood?" He gave a helpless shrug. I left him standing in his designer apartment with a drink he didn't want and a truth he couldn't swallow. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was finishing a bowl of risotto as I reported in. He listened with eyes half closed, and a napkin folded with geometrical precision in his lap. He said the borscht had to be red enough to suggest consequence, I finished. "What do you make of that?" Wolfe dabbed his mouth. That Hugo intended the meal as more than a gesture. It was meant to signify an ending. Whose? That remains unclear, but the symbolism is consistent. I paced the carpet. Ellis didn't know about the missing chapter, but he guessed it was important. Peyton's either hiding or silenced, and Celia's dancing around every question with silk shoes. What now? Wolfe pushed the plate away. "We force an error." "How?" "By baiting the hook. You will call Celia, invite her to dinner tomorrow. Tell her you've seen a version of Chapter 9. "Have I?" "No, but she needn't know that. Say it implies she manipulated Hugo for years, and that her inheritance was conditional upon confession. That ought to liven the appetizers. She will react, and her reaction will tell us whether she fears exposure or believes herself in control." I nodded. "And Ellis?" "Invite him as well. Say Wolfe wishes to discuss the estate. Mention the missing chapter casually. Let him stew." "And what will you be doing?" Wolfe leaned back, listening, watching, and preparing the final course. I reached for the phone. "What's on the menu?" Wolfe gave a rare smile. "Borscht." By the time the guests arrived, for dinner the following evening, the brownstone was polished like a pearl and tight with anticipation. Wolfe had ordered the dining room aired, the table reset with his favorite green Limoges china, and Fritz instructed to serve a 3-course Eastern European dinner, anchored by a ruby-red borscht that shimmered like a crime of passion. Celia, Domery, was the first to arrive 5 minutes early, composed and curious. She wore charcoal silk, and a look that could mean elegance or alarm depending on how you tilted your head. I greeted her at the door and led her into the dining room, where the faint scent of dill and beets hung like a prologue. Wolfe remained. In the office, he wouldn't appear until everyone was seated by design. Ellis Vanderlane showed up at 7:03, apologizing in the same breath he asked what was going on. "You said Wolfe wanted to discuss the estate," he murmured as I took his coat. "But this feels like a setup." "That's because it is," I told him. "A very civilized one. Don't worry. We're not serving justice à la carte." He frowned. "Then what?" "You'll see. Just don't spill anything, especially secrets." We sat at the dining table. Wolfe at the head, of course, flanked by Celia on his left and Ellis on his right. I took the end opposite Wolfe, a position earned over years of navigating both suspects and soup. Fritz emerged from the kitchen with the first course, mushroom blini with a smear of creme fraiche and chives, elegant, neutral, unprovocative, a diplomat of a dish. Polite conversation followed until the bowls arrived. The borscht. It was vibrant, thick, garnished with a dollop of sour cream cut with a sprig of dill. The room was still. Wolfe took one look, inhaled once, and picked up his spoon. Celia looked down at hers, and her lips parted, just slightly. Ellis shifted in his chair. "Let's not be coy," Wolfe said without looking up. "This dish was selected for symbolic weight. As you both know, it was to be the centerpiece of Hugo Domery's luncheon, the one he missed." Ellis cleared his throat. "Yes, but why are we—" "Because," Wolfe said, pausing to swirl his spoon, "Hugo's absence was not merely rude. It was calculated. This borscht was meant to convey judgment, and the person he intended to serve it to was never meant to eat it." Celia's spoon paused mid-air. "You're suggesting," she said carefully, "that the meal was a kind of message." "I'm stating it outright," Wolfe replied, "and I'm prepared to go further. I believe the missing chapter in Hugo's manuscript explained that message, and that its removal was not an act of panic, but of strategy." "Silence," Ellis finally said. "Then you think someone took the chapter to conceal what?" "To forestall an outcome," Wolfe said. "Chapter 9, we believe, contained Hugo's final commentary on inheritance, appetite, and betrayal. Thematic crescendo, yes, but also a personal reckoning. If released, it would have publicly and permanently altered the perception of someone close to him." "Me?" Ellis asked. "Possibly." Celia's gaze was sharper now. "And you think I removed it?" "I said no such thing," Wolfe murmured. "Though you did visit his publisher, inquire about the manuscript, and express concern about his manipulations. Those actions suggest proximity, if not opportunity." Ellis turned toward her. "Did you?" "I looked into it, yes. I had every right to," she replied coolly. "I was married to Charles. I lived through Hugo's tormenting brilliance. I wanted to know if he was turning it into another weapon." Wolfe raised a finger. "A fair motivation, but not exculpatory." Fritz entered with the next course, stuffed cabbage with tomato sauce, and the tension dipped just enough to let knives and forks resume their roles. Wolfe remained silent through the course, which for him is akin to thunderous concentration. I could feel it, the way a dog senses a storm in its bones. Once the plates were cleared, Wolfe gestured to me. I stood and retrieved a document from my inside coat pocket, 5 pages, photocopied from a draft Sol Panzer had traced to an off-site storage locker registered under Hugo's name. It wasn't the full Chapter 9, but it was enough. I placed it on the table between Wolfe and the others. Wolfe tapped the first page with a finger. An excerpt, not the original, but authentic. It describes a final act of culinary rebuke. A dish withheld, a meal promised and unserved, not as insult but as judgment. Ellis leaned forward. "So he planned to accuse someone publicly?" "Yes," Wolfe said, "and the person he intended to unmask knew it, and intervened." Celia's voice was low. "Are you accusing me or Ellis?" Wolfe didn't blink. "Neither yet, but consider the variables: a vanished assistant, a tampered manuscript, a luncheon never attended. Hugo made a choice, to disappear, to plant evidence, to stir reaction. You are his test subjects." Ellis shook his head. Then, "Where is he?" "That," Wolfe said, finally leaning back, "is the one question none of you have asked sincerely, and the only one I care to answer." Fritz appeared with dessert, plum dumplings with poppy seeds, and no one touched them. Wolfe folded his napkin. "Tomorrow at 10 in this office you will return, and you will hear the rest." Celia's eyes narrowed. You already know, don't you? Wolfe's voice was gentle. I know enough. The Borscht told me. She stood. And if I don't come, you will, he said. She left. Ellis followed a moment later, rattled, murmuring a thank you that didn't sound like gratitude. I stayed behind, sipping from my water glass. Wolfe poured a beer. You have it, then? I asked. Yes, Wolfe said. Want to tell me now? He swirled the bottle. Patience, Archie. The meal is almost finished. The check is yet to arrive. At precisely 10 o'clock the next morning, the Brownstones' doorbell rang, with a tone that carried more than punctuality. It carried expectation. Fritz answered while Wolfe remained in the office, planted in his chair like a judge awaiting trial. I was already at my desk, ready to take notes or block exits if the mood turned unfriendly. Ellis Vanderlane entered, first wearing a rumpled navy suit and the dazed look of a man who'd spent the night either not sleeping or trying to drink clarity out of an empty glass. Celia Domery followed 10 minutes later, immaculate as ever, though her lipstick was a shade more pronounced and her expression notably colder. Neither of them spoke, as Fritz ushered them into the office. Wolfe, as was his custom, let the silence build until it carried weight. Then, without preamble, he began. You are both here because you were part of Hugo Domery's final performance, he said. A man who saw life as a prolonged strategy session, relationships as feints and traps, and meals as weapons. He did not vanish by accident. He vanished with purpose. Ellis shifted. Then where is he? Safe, Wolfe replied. Or, as safe as any man can be when he's waging psychological war from the shadows. He arranged his absence to provoke action, and it worked. Celia crossed her legs. What action? You both reacted, Wolfe said. Ellis with concern and a desire for order. Celia with skepticism and guarded inquiry. Hugo knew those reactions would come. What he did not know, what he tested, was how far either of you would go to control the narrative. Ellis frowned. You're suggesting we tried to manipulate the outcome. I'm suggesting you already had. He turned to me. Archie, summarize. I stood. Here's what we know. Peyton Thorne, Hugo's assistant, was entrusted with a manuscript draft, including the notorious Chapter 9. That chapter is now missing. So is Peyton. His apartment showed signs of intrusion, specifically a broken drawer, likely where the chapter was stored. He hasn't been seen since. Celia stiffened but said nothing. I continued. The chapter, what we've reconstructed of it, details a final metaphorical meal, one that was promised, then withheld. Hugo uses it to condemn someone close to him, someone who fed off his legacy, who expected reward without earning it. He never names them, but the chapter's title, The Heir Who Asked Too Much, is suggestive. Ellis looked pained. So you think it was about me? I think Hugo wanted you to think that, Wolfe said, and that's the brilliance of it. He engineered a false suspicion to see what you would do under its weight. Celia glanced sideways at Ellis. And what did he do? Nothing criminal, Wolfe replied. But he told us about the Borscht, about the color, the symbolism, that it must be red enough to suggest consequence. That was a clue. Ellis leaned forward. A clue to what? To the fact that the meal was never meant to occur. Hugo never intended to arrive at the luncheon. He scheduled it to observe your reaction to his absence. I added, and your first thought wasn't concern for his safety. It was confusion about the message. You believed the Borscht was meant for you. Ellis turned red. Because I knew what it meant to him. That's not guilt. No, Wolfe said, but it is exposure, and it served his purpose. He turned to Celia. You, on the other hand, took a more active approach. You visited the publisher. You tried to assess the threat of the manuscript. I had every right, she said coolly. Agreed, Wolfe said. But when that failed to give you control, you pursued another route. Now her eyes narrowed, which was neutralizing the threat. You didn't know what Chapter 9 contained, but you knew what Hugo was capable of saying, and you couldn't risk it. So you had it removed. She didn't blink. You're accusing me of theft? Not in the ordinary sense. I believe Peyton Thorne delivered the manuscript to you before he vanished. I believe you persuaded him, by coercion, money, or some other leverage, to part with it. And then you destroyed Chapter 9. But you made one mistake. Wolfe gestured. To me. I reached into my folder and pulled out a page. The draft we recovered came from a storage unit Hugo opened under a pseudonym 2 weeks before his disappearance. He suspected someone might tamper with the official version, so he safeguarded a backup. Celia's mouth tightened. Wolfe said, "It wasn't complete, but it was enough." In the margin of a paragraph about manipulation at the dinner table, Hugo scribbled a single line. "Celia knows how to clear a plate without tasting the poison." "That's not evidence," she said. "It's context," Wolfe replied, "and it aligns with everything else. Peyton's disappearance, your publisher visit, the missing pages. You didn't need to frame Ellis, you just needed to keep yourself unchallenged." Ellis looked stunned. "You thought you were the target." She turned to him, voice sharper. "What did you think? That Hugo was going to crown you heir over me after everything?" He stood abruptly. "So you admit it?" "I admit I was afraid," she snapped. "Afraid of being smeared in that damn book. Afraid he'd turn my entire life into a parable." Wolfe raised a hand. "And that, Ms. Domery, is your real inheritance. Hugo left no will, no fortune worth fighting over. What he left was a legend, and you've now written yourself into its margins." She stared at him. "You can't prove any of this." "I don't have to," Wolfe said. "You've done the work for me. Mr. Thorne will surface eventually. Perhaps bitter, perhaps bruised, perhaps with a tale to sell, but the truth will leak out because Hugo designed it that way." I stepped forward. "And in the meantime, your silence will be noted by everyone who once ate at his table." Celia stood. She was still composed, but colder now. "Then this is finished. For you," Wolfe said. "For us, the course continues." She walked out. Ellis followed, still trying to piece together how he'd nearly become collateral. I shut the door behind them and returned to the office. Wolfe was already reaching for his beer. "So," I said, "no arrests, no police, just psychological carnage." "Precisely," he said. "Justice served raw." "And Chapter 9? Rewritten," Wolfe murmured. "As it always was. The real chapter is the one we lived." I nodded. "And dessert?" Fritz appeared on cue with a chocolate tart. Wolfe took a bite and sighed. "Ah, finally, something without metaphor." After Celia and Ellis had exited the brownstone, each carrying their own version of guilt, confusion, or vindication, I hung back in the hall, watching the door swing shut behind them. The weight of the morning still hung in the air, dense, as the scent of Fritz's post-reveal coffee, which I could now smell from the kitchen. It wasn't the first time we'd sent someone home without handcuffs or headlines, just a bruised ego and a legacy to reconsider. Wolfe called that justice. I called it Wednesday. Back in the office, Wolfe was nursing his beer, fingers steepled over his considerable midsection, eyes closed but not asleep. He wasn't digesting lunch, he was digesting the consequences. I waited until he spoke. "They will not recover quickly," he said without opening his eyes. "Which one?" I asked. Celia, who watched her grasp on the Domery legacy disintegrate, or Ellis, who just realized his uncle didn't trust him enough to leave behind so much as a library card. "Both," Wolfe said, "but it hardly matters. Hugo's intent was not inheritance, it was revelation. He wanted to die mythic. Is he dead? Not yet. That earned him a glance. "You're sure?" "I'm certain he intended the world to believe he'd disappeared. But he's alive, watching, waiting, and now satisfied." I leaned against the desk. "So what now? You going to call Kramer? Tell him we cracked a case no one filed?" "No," Wolfe said flatly. "There is no crime. At least none the law would recognize. Theft of intent is not prosecuted." "And Peyton Thorne?" "Panzer found him late last night, unharmed, staying in a borrowed apartment in Morningside Heights. Voluntarily." Wolfe opened his eyes. "Voluntarily enough. Mr. Merry paid him to disappear under the guise of protecting Hugo's legacy. Peyton took the money. He also kept a copy of the chapter. Just in case," I whistled. "Everyone had insurance, as Hugo predicted they would. That was the part I couldn't shake. Hugo hadn't just planned a vanishing act. He'd crafted a labyrinth, baiting each player with just enough guilt, pride, or paranoia to make them act on their own worst instincts. The man may not have had a will, but he'd left behind a stage production so intricately blocked it could have played Broadway. I pulled out my notebook and flipped to my scribbled timeline. So, for posterity, Hugo writes his manuscript. He includes Chapter 9, which functions as his final judgment on someone in his inner circle. But he doesn't name them. "Correct," Wolfe said. "He suspects interference, so he places a copy in a hidden location, then arranges a luncheon he never intends to attend, knowing Ellis will panic and Celia will circle the wagons." "Yes." "Peyton delivers the manuscript, but either gets cold feet or a hot offer from Celia and vanishes, leaving the pages tampered." Wolfe nodded. "Leaving Hugo to observe who scrambles, who hides, and who attempts to rewrite the narrative. And then we enter, right on cue." "Indeed," Wolfe said. "We are excellent catalysts." I closed the notebook. "So that's it? No handshakes? No bow from the maestro himself?" "He may reach out," Wolfe said, lifting his glass. "Or he may not. That is his privilege." I thought about that, about a man choosing to orchestrate his disappearance rather than risk the indignity of misinterpretation. Hugo de Merry had turned his life and death into a final essay, annotated with ego, spite, and genius. "You'd have liked him," I said. "I didn't," Wolfe said without hesitation. "He was an intellectual narcissist, but I respected his methodology." "That's the Wolfe version of a hug," I muttered. Wolfe sighed. "It was not his vanity that disturbed me. It was the way he weaponized truth. That is always the most dangerous tool." I stood. "So what happens to the chapter?" "It remains with me. I've sent a copy to Mr. Rayner, Hugo's editor, under seal and explicit instruction." "He'll publish it?" Wolfe looked amused. "He'll publish something. Whether it's Hugo's original words or a neutered shadow of them remains to be seen." "And what about the manuscript's targets?" "They've been served," Wolfe said. "Not by the courts, but by their own conscience." I headed for the door. "Remind me never to make you mad over dinner." "You rarely eat with the required attention," he replied, "but your taste in truth remains tolerable." That was about as close as Wolfe got to a compliment. Later that afternoon, I dropped by Saul Panzer's place to hand off a thank you and a bourbon Wolfe had selected himself. Panzer didn't ask for details, he never did. Just said, "The niece was sharp, the assistant was scared, the old man's gone. You're the clean-up crew." He wasn't wrong. I stopped at the Knickerbocker Club on my way back, stepped inside the lobby, and stared at the room where Hugo's borscht had gone uneaten. The table was empty, the linens were fresh, but I could still feel the weight of the absence. When I returned home, Wolfe was in the dining room with a plate of braised duck and lentils. He didn't look up. "Join me, Archie." I sat. Fritz poured the wine. We ate. No one mentioned borscht, or guilt, or missing pages. Just food, just silence, just another masterpiece, solved and swallowed. It was a Friday afternoon when the final piece, clicked into place, not with a bang or even a phone call, but a soft rustle of paper. Wolfe and I were in the office. He was pretending to read Montaigne, but was really waiting for the mail. I was genuinely reading the Gazette and keeping one eye on the clock in case Inspector Kramer decided to show up uninvited, as he occasionally did when his ulcers were particularly vengeful and Wolfe had something to irritate him with. Fritz came in quietly and handed Wolfe a small pale envelope. No return address, but the handwriting was familiar. Angular, precise, self-assured, Hugo Domery. Wolfe turned it over, opened it with a letter opener shaped like a miniature sword, and unfolded a single sheet of heavyweight paper. His eyes flicked down it once, then again more slowly. He passed it to me without a word. The letter was brief. To Mr. Wolfe. Thank you for keeping the pot stirred but not boiled. The ingredients did not disappoint. Celia was predictable, Ellis earnest, and Peyton malleable. All in all, a fine, final dish. You were not part of my original recipe, but your presence improved the flavor. Your method, though inelegant, was effective. It clarified the broth. I shall remain at my current remove, not for fear, but for freedom. If you ever wish to dine on something truly dangerous, you know where I do not live. Hugo D. Modest. To the last, I muttered, folding it back up. Wolfe took it and slipped it into the center drawer of his desk. The letter confirms everything. Which part? That he considers himself not a fugitive, but a philosopher in exile. You believe he'll stay gone? Yes. I leaned back in my chair. That's what gets me. He didn't vanish out of fear. He vanished for punctuation. The whole thing was a thesis, with footnotes in red and passive-aggressive soup. He wanted his absence to have more meaning than his presence, Wolfe said. Hard trick to pull, I said, and still leave everyone flailing like fish. Out of water. Wolfe leaned back, closed his eyes. He did not flail. He chose silence as coda. I whistled. And Celia? She will stew, Wolfe replied. In money, in reputation, in regret. She succeeded in suppressing one truth, but Hugo, in typical fashion, left enough fragments behind to seed doubt. She'll spend the rest of her days wondering who else knows. And Ellis? A man relieved to have lost nothing tangible, Wolfe said, but perhaps aware now that what he wanted most was never available to him. I got up and walked to the window. Outside, New York was busy being New York. Taxis honking at red lights, couples arguing over umbrellas, delivery guys flying down sidewalks like cyclists in a demolition derby. Normal chaos, the kind that doesn't need mystery to be loud. I'll say one thing, I said. For a guy who hated people, Hugo Domery knew exactly how to make them dance. He didn't hate people, Wolfe said from behind me. He mistrusted them. There is a difference. I'll take your word for it. I turned around. So, case closed? Wolfe opened his eyes. It was never a case. It was a performance. We merely provided the lighting. Just then, the phone rang. I picked it up. Nero Wolfe's residence. Archie Goodwin speaking. The voice on the other end was Saul Panzer. You'll want to know this, he said. Peyton Thorne just sold the missing chapter. I straightened. To who? To a private collector, not the publisher. Some big-shot academic at Columbia, who wants to use it for a lecture series on ethics and authorship. Let me guess. Anonymous buyer, cash offer? More or less. No legal paper trail, but I got a copy. Want me to drop it off? Definitely. Wolfe'll want the full version. On my way. I hung up and turned to Wolfe. Chapter 9 just found a second life. He nodded, unsurprised. It always would. Truth deferred is still truth. 30 minutes later, Saul arrived and handed me a sealed envelope. Inside, the complete Chapter 9, handwritten final draft. Not the copy we'd seen. This one was sharper, meaner, unmistakably Hugo. It opened with a single damning line. To inherit without understanding is to consume without tasting. The chapter dissected the notion of entitlement. It accused not by name but by behavior, documenting a pattern of guests at Hugo's table who came for the wine and stayed for the power. There were unmistakable references to Ellis's quiet deference, to Celia's strategic silences, to Peyton's echoes of brilliance. It ended with the metaphor of a table left set, but empty. Wolfe read it slowly, sipping beer. When he finished, he placed it flat on his desk. "Cruel," he said, "but exact." "Will it get published now?" "No," Wolfe said. "It will be quoted, debated, misinterpreted, but not published. That was never Hugo's aim. He wanted control, not legacy." We sat a while. The city hummed outside. The orchids upstairs were likely flourishing, unaware or unimpressed by all the manipulations below. Finally, Wolfe stood, slowly, and made for the dining room. "Fritz is making osso buco." "A celebration?" "No," he said, stepping through the door. "A restoration." I followed, because after a mystery about food, family, and the hungriest kinds of betrayal, what better way to end than with a meal that asked for nothing but appreciation? The brownstone was quiet again. Order restored. Case closed. Dinner served. Weather turned unseasonably warm that weekend, as if the city was trying to melt the last traces of the Domeri drama into the sidewalks. Inside the brownstone, though, the air was as it always was, climate-controlled, orderly, and thick with the aroma of Fritz's veal stock and old books. Wolfe had resumed his orchids. I had resumed pretending to dust things while reading the sports pages. It was business as usual, until the doorbell rang. It was Saul Panzer again, this time with no envelope, no news, just a slow, knowing look and a single word. Resolved. He meant Peyton Thorne had decided to vanish permanently, courtesy of a discreet grant from an anonymous Literary Preservation Foundation that definitely rhymed with Celia Domeri's bank account. The manuscript minus Chapter 9 was back in editorial hands. The collector who'd bought the missing chapter had quietly donated it to Columbia's Rare Books Archive. Hugo's little firestorm would now be discussed by scholars instead of detectives. Saul didn't linger. He never did. I brought Wolfe the news in the office, where he sat beneath the glare of the afternoon sun, filtering through the blinds, a small bowl of poached apricots on the table beside him. He listened, nodded, and without looking up from the index of gastronomic symbolism in Central Europe, said, "That's the last note in the scale." I leaned against the desk. "So, Hugo wins." Wolfe looked at me. "Define victory." He disappeared. Exposed two would-be heirs as opportunists. Got the last word, without saying it aloud. "Sounds like a win to me." "No," Wolfe said. Hugo staged a disappearance because he could no longer command attention with his presence. He used absence to restore his relevance. Which worked. Temporarily, Wolfe said. But power rooted in mystery must always fade. He has enshrined himself, yes. But enshrinement is not influence. It is isolation. That made me pause. "So you pity him?" "I do not pity anyone who weaponizes intimacy," he said flatly. He turned every meal into a test, every conversation into a trap. He punished loyalty and rewarded performance. That is not genius. That is cruelty refined. I whistled low. "Still, you played along." "I extracted the truth," he said, "which is my vocation, not my pleasure." I sat back down. "And Celia? What happens when she realizes no one's buying her reinvention?" "She'll spin," Wolfe said. But not freely. Hugo left too many hooks. She'll live in anticipation of exposure that may never come. "Ellis? He will recover," Wolfe said. "He lacks the self-reflection to internalize lasting shame. That is both his weakness and his salvation." I smiled. "You should write a book." "No," he said, reaching for a bottle of beer. Books require readers. I prefer orchids. I stood. And if Hugo ever resurfaces? He won't. Wolfe said. His ego is too satisfied. His hunger for once has been sated. Outside, the sun dipped low. I stepped out onto the stoop and watched a delivery van double park and a kid chase a hat across the sidewalk. Life was doing what life does, marching forward, indifferent to vanished men and metaphorical soups. Inside, Fritz called that dinner was served. I returned to the dining room. The plates were already on the table. Poached trout, lemon parsley, butter perfect as a painting. Wolfe appeared a moment later, clean shirt, appetite engaged, and no sign that we'd just closed one of the strangest cases the brownstone had ever seen, without a single corpse, arrest, or confession. He sat, poured himself a glass of Riesling and lifted his fork. Archie, he said, some men measure legacy in marble, others in memory. Hugo Domery chose neither. He measured it in silence. I picked up my fork, and still managed to be the loudest man in the room. Wolfe nodded once. Indeed, we ate. No one mentioned Borscht. No one needed to. The brownstone was quiet, and once again order was restored.